Rain slid down the cracked headstones like tears. The small cemetery on the outskirts of Bardstown, Kentucky, was silent except for the low hum of cicadas and the distant rumble of thunder. The winter air carried that strange damp chill, the kind that clung to your lungs and made you feel the weight of the past pressing in. A woman knelt on the muddy ground, her faded cardigan soaked through, but she didn't seem to notice. Her hands trembled as she traced the engraved letters with her fingertips. Melissa and Harper. January 14, 1969 to July 17, 1988. 37 years. Mary Harper's breath shuddered as she exhaled. For nearly 4 decades, this was the only place she came when the weight of not knowing became too much. Every week, without fail, she cleaned the dirt off Melissa's headstone, changed the flowers, and whispered the same question into the cold stone. Why? Behind her, a faint static crackled from a parked Ford sedan. A voice broke through the muffled hiss of rain on the car roof. Breaking news this morning. Kentucky State Police have confirmed an arrest in the 1988 murder of 19-year-old Melissa Harper. The suspect, a 61-year-old man from Tennessee, was taken into custody just before dawn. The news anchor's voice sounded distant, almost unreal, as if it were coming from another lifetime. Mary's son, Daniel, leaned against the car, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the ground. At 4'9", his shoulders carried more than his age. He hadn't wanted to come here today, but when the call came from Detective Ramirez at 5 a.m., he knew his mother would need him. Mary finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Danny, they found him." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, Ma. They did." But even as the words left his mouth, the truth didn't feel real. The camera shifts, in our minds, at least, back to the then. July 16, 1988. A sticky summer night in Bardstown. Melissa Harper, 19 and full of plans, left her shift at the Bluebird Diner just after 11 p.m. She never made it home. The next 2 days unraveled into chaos. A frantic search party scoured the riverbanks and woods. Police dogs tracked her scent to an abandoned farmhouse, then lost it. By the 3rd day, Bardstown wasn't just a small town anymore, it was a place holding its breath. And when Melissa's body was finally found, hidden beneath a tangle of cedar and honeysuckle, something inside this quiet community broke. 4 years, the investigation churned through suspects, false leads, and whispered theories. Melissa's name became part of Bardstown's folklore, the story kids dared each other to repeat when driving past the dark stretch of highway where she was last seen. Her mother never stopped calling the sheriff's office. Daniel never stopped replaying that last day in his head, the joke Melissa told over dinner, the hug she gave him before heading to work. But the case went cold. Until now. Mary stood slowly, wiping damp soil from her knees. Her fingers were still pressed to her daughter's name, as if letting go might erase her again. "I prayed for this day," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "But it don't feel the way I thought it would." Daniel glanced toward the car, where the radio announcer was still speaking. DNA evidence, preserved for decades, linked the suspect to the crime. Authorities believe he had been living under an alias in Tennessee since the early 1990s. Daniel clenched his jaw. He remembered those woods, the heat, the heavy smell of honeysuckle, the flashing lights. And now, all these years later, the killer had been living just 2 hours away. A sudden gust of wind carried the scent of rain-soaked earth. Somewhere far off, a train horn wailed. Mary turned to her son, eyes glassy but sharp. "Tell me something, Danny. Does this mean it's over?" Daniel hesitated. "It means we finally know." But both of them knew better. Because when a wound stays open for nearly 4 decades, justice doesn't sew it shut. It just stops the bleeding. Somewhere, in a Tennessee county jail, a man sat under harsh fluorescent lights, waiting for the detectives who'd finally pieced together the truth. He thought he'd buried his secrets deep enough. He thought wrong. And for the first time since 1988, Bardstown was waking up. Summer 1988, Bardstown, Kentucky. The cicadas were already screaming when the sun came up over Bardstown. Back then, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at the pace of the bourbon barrels rolling through the warehouses. There were 2 stoplights, 1 high school, and a diner that doubled as the heartbeat of Main Street. That's where Melissa and Harper spent most of her evenings, serving coffee refills and smiling at regulars who treated her like family. She was 19, with bright auburn hair that caught the sun like fire and a laugh that carried across the diner floor. Melissa had a habit of tucking her pen behind her ear when she was concentrating, even if she wasn't taking orders. Her friends joked she'd end up managing the Bluebird someday, but Melissa had bigger plans. She wanted out. Her best friend, Carrie Thompson, recalls decades later. Not in a bad way, she loved Bardstown. But she used to say, "I want to be more than just another girl who stays here." Melissa wanted to be a nurse. She'd saved up enough for a semester's tuition at a community college in Louisville, and her acceptance letter still sits, yellowed and creased, in a box of her belongings. Melissa at home. On July 14, 1988, 3 days before her death, the Harper home was alive with music and laughter. Melissa danced barefoot in the kitchen, twirling to George Michael's Faith blasting from a cassette deck. Her younger brother Daniel, 14 at the time, sat at the table pretending to do homework but really just watching her spin. She was light, Daniel recalls now, his voice breaking slightly. She made everything feel less heavy. You couldn't be mad around her. She wouldn't let you. Mary Harper, their mother, tried to play the role of the worry. She'd scold Melissa for working too many late shifts, for walking to her car alone, for dreaming too big. But the truth is, she admired her daughter's stubbornness. Melissa had an independence rare for small-town Kentucky in the late 80s. She read medical textbooks on her breaks, clipped recipes from magazines, and planned everything, right down to the color of her apartment walls when she'd finally moved to Louisville. Pale yellow. Always pale yellow. The Bluebird Diner. The Bluebird was Bardstown's gathering place, a narrow, neon-lit diner wedged between a pawn shop and a pharmacy. By day, retirees nursed cups of black coffee. By night, it was teenagers, truckers, and locals fresh from late shifts at the distillery. Melissa thrived there. She was quick, recalls Louise Carter, the diner's owner. Could balance 3 plates on one arm without spilling a drop. Customers loved her. She'd remember what you ordered before you sat down. It wasn't just her smile or her service, Melissa listened. She knew which marriages were failing, which teens were sneaking out, and which regulars were one paycheck away from losing everything. In a town where gossip moved faster than mail, Melissa heard it all, but she never repeated a word. Still, working nights came with its dangers. There was this one guy, Carrie admits. He'd hang around the diner sometimes. Older. Creepy. Melissa always brushed it off, but I didn't like the way he looked at her. She doesn't give his name in the interview, but it'll surface later, and when it does, the entire case will shift. July 16, 1988, the last day. That Saturday started like any other. Melissa woke up early, spent the morning helping her mother hang laundry, and borrowed Carrie's curling iron to get ready for her shift. Around 5 p.m., she left for the diner in her blue '82 Chevy Cavalier, windows rolled down, radio blasting Fleetwood Mac's Gypsy. Multiple people remember seeing her that night. 8:15 p.m., serving coffee to a pair of truckers passing through town. 9:40 p.m., laughing with Carrie by the counter, flipping through a bridal magazine they couldn't afford. 10:55 p.m., clocking out after a busy shift, tucking her tips into a small coin purse. Security footage from a nearby gas station, grainy and unreliable by modern standards, shows her car heading south just before midnight. She never made it home. Aftermath for the family. Mary Harper says she knew something was wrong the moment she woke up and saw Melissa's bedroom empty. By noon the next day, her photo was circulating around Bardstown. By nightfall, dozens of volunteers were combing through riverbanks, farms, and woods. Daniel, just a kid at the time, remembers standing barefoot in the driveway, staring at the police cars parked outside. I thought they'd bring her back. I thought maybe she was lost or scared. I didn't understand, not then, that she was gone. Melissa's father, Richard Harper, withdrew into himself after her death. He stopped coaching Little League, stopped showing up at the distillery, stopped talking about the future. When he passed in 1997 from a sudden heart attack, Mary told people it was grief that killed him. Ripple effects across Bardstown. Melissa's murder didn't just devastate her family, it scarred the entire community. Bardstown wasn't used to violent crime. People stopped leaving doors unlocked. Parents forbade their daughters from walking alone at night. Local papers ran headlines like, "Who killed Melissa Harper?" Rumors spread like wildfire. Some pointed to Melissa's ex-boyfriend, Jason Moore, known for jealousy and a short temper. Others whispered about an out-of-town drifter, a man seen camping by the river. Carrie says it felt like the town turned on itself. Everyone was looking over their shoulder. Every shadow felt dangerous. And still, nothing. No answers. The stakes that remained. 4 years, Melissa's death became more than a murder, it became a wound Bardstown carried in silence. Mary Harper stopped celebrating holidays. Daniel grew up under the shadow of Melissa's brother. Carrie moved to Louisville and avoided Bardstown altogether, unable to drive past the Bluebird without breaking down. But the thing about small towns? They remember. The waitress with the auburn hair. The nursing student who never got the chance. The girl who wanted pale yellow walls. For nearly 4 decades, Melissa Harper became more than a victim. She became a symbol. Of innocence stolen. Of justice delayed. Of questions that haunted an entire generation. And yet, buried deep in an evidence box in a dusty police basement, a tiny sliver of hope waited, a single swab of DNA beneath Melissa's fingernails, too small for the technology of 1988, but perfectly preserved for the day science would catch up. That day was coming. July 16, 1988, Bardstown, Kentucky. The heat lingered long after sunset, clinging to the sidewalks and rooftops like a damp blanket. Bardstown smelled of bourbon mash from the distillery, honeysuckle from the riverbank, and exhaust fumes from pickup trucks cruising Main Street. For Melissa Harper, it was just another Saturday night. She worked the late shift at the Bluebird Diner, same as she had all summer, saving every tip for nursing school. At 5:02 p.m., she parked her blue '82 Chevy Cavalier out back, adjusted the strap of her canvas purse, and headed inside, unaware it would be the last time she'd walk through those glass doors. 5:30 p.m., Carrie's memory. It was busy that night, recalls Carrie Thompson, Melissa's best friend, interviewed decades later. Every booth was full, and she was flying between tables like she had wings. Melissa was glowing, Carrie says. She'd gotten a letter that morning confirming her financial aid package for community college. Between tips and a little help from Mary, her mom, she'd finally saved enough. She said, "Carrie, come August, I'm outta here." I was happy for her. God, I didn't know that'd be the last time she told me anything. Carrie remembers one more thing, a man in his late 20s, sitting alone at the counter, nursing a Coke he never touched. He watched her. Not like he was admiring her, like he was studying her. I got a bad feeling, but Melissa just laughed it off. She never caught his name. But later, investigators would. 7:10 p.m., a confrontation. Jason Moore, Melissa's ex-boyfriend, stopped by the diner unannounced. Jason was 22, worked construction, and had a reputation for jealousy and a temper. Louise Carter, the diner's owner, remembers stepping out from the kitchen when she heard raised voices. "I saw Melissa at the register, arms crossed, jaw tight." Jason was leaning against the counter, smirking, trying to act casual. Bits of conversation overheard. "Jason, heard you're heading to Louisville." "Melissa, so what if I am? It's my life, Jason." "Jason, don't get smart with me." Louise intervened before it escalated, asking Jason to leave. He glared but walked out without another word. Later, Jason claimed he went straight home. But no one could verify it. 9:40 p.m., the bridal magazine. Between refills and dessert orders, Melissa sat on the counter flipping through a glossy bridal magazine with Carrie. They laughed over the price tags, circling dresses neither of them could afford. She wasn't engaged or anything, Carrie explains in a 2025 interview. "We were just dreaming, like we always did." She said one day she wanted pale yellow walls and a little white house with a porch swing. She wanted everything. 10:55 p.m., clocking out. Melissa's last punch card still sits in evidence, ink faded but legible. 10:55 p.m., July 16, 1988. Louise remembers hugging her goodbye. She said, "See you Monday, Ms. Louise." But she never made it to Monday. Melissa walked out the back door to the parking lot. The diner's exterior lights had burned out days earlier, leaving the alley in near total darkness. No cameras. No witnesses. 11:18 p.m., the gas station sighting. Rick Holloway, a gas station attendant working the night shift, gave a statement the following week. "She stopped here to top off her tank. I remember 'cause she was humming Fleetwood Mac, had that cassette blasting. Paid cash. Didn't say much." Rick swears he saw a dark green pickup truck pull into the far corner of the lot while Melissa was pumping gas. He couldn't see the driver clearly, but remembers the license plate was from Tennessee. By the time Rick looked again, both Melissa and the truck were gone. 11:45 p.m., a shadow near the river. A couple parked near the old Caldwell Bridge reported hearing a scream around 11:45 p.m. They assumed it was teenagers fooling around. Bardstown had its share of ghost stories, and the woods near the river were prime dare material. But when police searched that area 2 days later, they found Melissa's abandoned Cavalier. Inside. Her purse, untouched. $84 in tip money still folded neatly inside. A single sneaker under the driver's seat. It wasn't robbery. Midnight, the pickup truck. Another witness, a farmer named Harlan Jessup, later claimed he saw a young woman arguing with a man outside an unfamiliar pickup near his property, just a mile from the Caldwell Bridge. I heard shouting, like she was mad. Then a door slammed, and they were gone. At the time, Harlan didn't report it. Not until years later. Back then, without cell phones, without modern databases, a sighting like this could vanish into nothing. Red herrings and rising tensions. By the following morning, theories bloomed across Bardstown. Some were convinced Jason Moore snapped after their diner argument. Others swore River Mike, a homeless drifter known to camp near the bridge, was involved. A few even whispered Melissa had planned to run off with someone, though Mary Harper dismissed that outright. The truth was simpler, darker, and far more patient. Foreshadowing in the evidence. Crime scene photos, too graphic for public release, show something investigators didn't understand in 1988 but would later become pivotal. Melissa's fingernails were broken, her knuckles bruised. There was a fight. And beneath those fingernails, sealed inside a tiny evidence envelope and forgotten for decades, was the answer Bardstown had been chasing: skin cells belonging to a man no one suspected. Flash forward, 2023. In the present day, Detective Alejandro Ramirez flips through Melissa's old case file. The edges are soft, smudged with decades of handling. He pauses on an evidence log entry. Item 23B, fingernail scrapings. Stored. Unprocessed. His pen hovers. The DNA will change everything. The morning of October 16, 1988, dawned cold and damp in rural Breathitt County, Kentucky. A low fog clung to the valley floor, weaving between the skeletal outlines of half-bare trees. For most of the town, it was a Sunday like any other, families gathering for church, farmers tending to their land. But for one hunter making his way along a deer trail outside the small town of Jackson, it would become a day forever burned into memory. The man was Earl Whitaker, a 54-year-old retired coal miner with a limp from years underground. He had set out at first light, shotgun slung over his shoulder, hoping to bring home venison for the freezer. The woods were quiet, only the sound of his boots crunching through leaves and the occasional crack of a squirrel darting across branches. It was just past 8:30 a.m. when Earl noticed something unusual near the tree line. At first glance, he thought it was a pile of discarded clothing left by trespassers. But as he stepped closer, the shape resolved into something human. His heart lurched. Lying on her side, partially obscured by brush, was the body of a young woman. Earl froze, unable to process what he was seeing. Her hair, a tangled shade of chestnut brown, fanned across the earth. Her jeans and sweater were stained, torn in places. She wasn't moving. The earth around her was darkened by something unmistakable. "She's just a girl," Earl whispered to himself, his throat dry. He took a step back, trembling, before turning and hurrying down the trail, his limp now a desperate, uneven sprint. He would later tell police that his only thought was to find help. He couldn't bear to look again. The first responders. By 9:15 a.m., the quiet woods were alive with flashing lights. Sheriff's deputies, Kentucky State Police troopers, and the county coroner arrived at the scene. Word spread quickly in the small town. There'd been a body found in the hills. Deputy Tommy Waller, just 26 at the time, was one of the first on scene. He would later recall the surreal stillness of the forest as he ducked under the yellow tape. "She didn't look real at first," he told reporters decades later. "Like she could have been asleep, if not for," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The victim was soon identified by the coroner as Melissa Harper, the 19-year-old from town who had been reported missing just 2 nights before. The confirmation rippled through the community like a thunderclap. Melissa, bright, full of life, with her whole future ahead of her, was gone. The crime scene. Investigators meticulously documented the scene. Melissa's body lay about 20 yards off the dirt road, suggesting she had been dragged or carried. The ground showed signs of disturbance: broken branches, scuffed soil, shoe impressions partially obscured by fallen leaves. Her clothing bore tears inconsistent with ordinary wear, hinting at a struggle. The coroner noted bruising on her arms, abrasions on her hands, and evidence suggesting she had fought fiercely in her final moments. There was blood near her head and chest, though the weapon used was not immediately clear. Some believed she had been struck, others suspected stabbing. The truth would only come later, in the coroner's report. What stood out most to detectives, however, was what was missing. Melissa's purse was gone. So was the small gold locket she was known to wear, a gift from her mother on her high school graduation just months earlier. These details would raise questions. Was this a robbery gone wrong? Or had the missing items been taken as a trophy by her killer? The emotional impact. When news reached town, shock gave way to grief and fear. At First Baptist Church, where Melissa's family often attended Sunday services, the congregation stopped mid-sermon when word spread. Neighbors embraced, many openly weeping. Some locked their doors that night for the first time in years. Melissa had been the kind of girl who babysat neighborhood kids, worked part-time at the diner, and waved at everyone she passed on the street. Now, to imagine her body discarded in the woods, it felt like a violation not just of her, but of the town's sense of safety. Her parents, Diana and Robert Harper, were brought to the sheriff's office that afternoon. Diana collapsed when the sheriff delivered the confirmation, her sobs echoing through the hallway. Robert sat rigid, staring at the floor, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. She was supposed to be safe here, Diana whispered through tears. She was just a girl. Investigative steps. Crime scene technicians worked quickly, though technology in 1988 was far more limited than what we know today. Photographs were taken with film cameras, measurements noted by hand in spiral-bound notebooks. Soil samples were collected, though no one could be certain whether future forensic science would make them useful. A cast was made of a partial shoe print found near the body. Deputies combed the area for Melissa's missing belongings, but they found nothing. The coroner estimated she had been killed late Friday night or early Saturday morning, just hours after she was last seen leaving the diner where she worked. That narrowed the timeline, but it also deepened the urgency. Her killer had been out there, possibly among the very neighbors gathered outside the sheriff's office demanding answers. The press descends. By evening, word had spread beyond Breathitt County. Louisville newspapers ran the headline: Body of missing teen found in Breathitt County woods. Local TV stations carried grainy footage of sheriff's deputies carrying evidence bags from the forest. For a quiet Kentucky town, this was a sudden and uninvited spotlight. Reporters camped outside the Harper home. Microphones were thrust toward family friends, asking if Melissa had enemies, if she had been afraid of someone. Most shook their heads. Melissa was kind, well-liked, with no known conflicts. But whispers began to swirl, rumors about her final shift at the diner, about strangers passing through town that night, about a car seen idling near the road. The story was spreading, and with it, speculation. As darkness fell that Sunday, the crime scene tape fluttered in the wind. The woods, once filled with voices, grew quiet again. Melissa's body had been taken away for autopsy, but the weight of her absence lingered in the air. For investigators, this was only the beginning. For the Harper family, it was the start of a nightmare with no end in sight. The sheriff would tell his deputies that night, "We're not just hunting for a killer. We're fighting for Melissa. Don't forget that." And yet, despite the determination, no one could know then that it would take decades, and the rise of new forensic science, before the truth of what happened to Melissa Harper would finally come to light. June 14, 1988, Benton County, Kentucky. The summer heat clung to Benton County like a wet blanket, and yet the crime scene around the Harper family barn felt cold in its silence. Sheriff Raymond Ray Colton, a stocky man with graying temples and a reputation for doggedness, adjusted his hat against the midday sun as he surveyed the spot where Melissa Harper's body had been found less than 12 hours ago. The barn sat on the edge of a gravel road off Highway 68, flanked by miles of soybean fields that swayed lazily under the summer breeze. A place where nothing ever happened. Until now. Ray crouched near the old oak tree just yards away from where Melissa's lifeless body had been discovered. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered faintly in the wind, a garish interruption to the otherwise idyllic countryside. "Cause of death looks like blunt force trauma," muttered Deputy Carl Whitaker, flipping through his notepad. He was young, barely 26, and his nervous energy was palpable. "Coroner says it was quick. No signs of, well, anything else. Yet." Ray grunted. "Nothing else yet. But we don't assume. We verify." The first leads. Inside the Harper farmhouse, Melissa's parents sat stiffly at the kitchen table. Helen Harper clutched a dish towel in both hands, wringing it so tightly it looked ready to tear. Richard Harper, Melissa's father, sat beside her, his sunburned face locked in grim silence. "We let her go out last night," Helen whispered, her voice trembling. "She was just supposed to grab a soda with her friend, Angie. Said she'd be home before dark." "Who was she with?" Ray asked gently, notebook poised. "Angie Morris," Helen said. "They were at the Dairy Queen off Route 9. Melissa dropped her off around 9:30. She never came home." Ray scribbled the details, his mind already forming a mental timeline. Last seen, 9:30 p.m. Body discovered, 6:45 a.m. Location, 2 miles from the Harper home. Somewhere in that 9-hour window, Melissa's life had ended. Interviewing the last friend to see her. By early afternoon, Angie Morris, Melissa's closest friend, sat in an interrogation room at the Benton County Sheriff's Office. Her mascara had run in messy streaks, her hands trembling as she clutched a styrofoam cup of untouched water. "She was fine when she dropped me off," Angie said, her voice cracking. "We were laughing about some dumb thing at work. She didn't say anything about meeting anyone." "Did Melissa have a boyfriend?" Ray asked. Angie hesitated, twisting a strand of her blonde hair around her finger. "Kind of. She was talking to Eddie Langston again. They'd been on and off since high school." Ray glanced at Carl, who was jotting furiously. Eddie Langston was a name he knew. 20 years old. Son of the town mechanic. History of fights and temper problems. Eddie Langston, first person of interest. Later that evening, Eddie sat slouched on a metal chair in the same interrogation room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Tattoos crept up his forearms, a rebellious badge of a boy growing into a man too fast. "Yeah, I saw Melissa last night," Eddie admitted flatly. "She came by the shop around 10. We talked. That's it." Ray leaned forward. "About what?" "She wanted to get back together," Eddie said, smirking faintly. "I told her I wasn't sure. We argued a little, but she left. That's the last I saw her." "Anyone who can confirm that?" Ray pressed. "Nah," Eddie shrugged. "I was locking up alone." Ray exchanged a look with Carl. Alone. No alibi. The clues that didn't fit. By the third day of the investigation, the Harper case was already starting to unravel into conflicting pieces. Melissa's purse was missing but her jewelry was untouched, ruling out robbery. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting she either trusted her killer or was ambushed. The dirt path leading from the barn had fresh tire tracks. Measurements suggested a small pickup truck or compact car. A single cigarette butt was found near the barn, unfiltered Pall Mall, a brand Melissa didn't smoke. Deputy Carl logged every scrap into evidence, but Ray couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that they were circling a much larger truth. The community reacts. In small-town Kentucky, bad news traveled faster than lightning. Within 48 hours, Melissa Harper's murder dominated whispered conversations at the diner, the gas station, and Sunday church services. The Harper's mailbox overflowed with sympathy cards, casseroles stacked in foil tins filled the kitchen counters, and yet Helen Harper stood hollow-eyed, unable to eat or sleep. Local reporters began crowding the sheriff's office. "Brutal murder rocks Benton County," screamed the headline of the Kentucky Courier. But beneath the surface, fear spread like wildfire. "Makes you wonder who's out there," an elderly man muttered outside the grocery store. "If they can do that to Melissa." The pressure mounts. By the end of the first week, Sheriff Colton found himself in the crosshairs. Town leaders wanted quick answers. The press wanted suspects. Melissa's parents wanted justice. "Ray, we can't sit on this forever," Mayor Don Larkin barked during a tense meeting. "Folks are scared. They want someone in cuffs." Ray rubbed his temples, exhausted. "I'm not hauling some kid in just to calm the town. We find who did this, the right way." An unsettling discovery. Then, on the 8th day, a break came, or so it seemed. A farmer reported seeing a red Ford Ranger parked near the barn the night of Melissa's disappearance. Eddie Langston owned a red Ranger. But when deputies searched the truck, they found it spotless, wiped down so thoroughly it practically gleamed. "Too clean," Ray muttered, running a hand along the dashboard. "He's hiding something." They seized the truck for forensic testing, but in 1988, forensic science was still in its infancy. No DNA databases. No rapid testing. No easy answers. The investigation stalls. Weeks turned into months, and the Benton County Sheriff's Office began running out of leads. Witness statements dried up. Eddie Langston lawyered up. The cigarette butt went untested, stored in an evidence bag that would gather dust for decades. By August, the Harper case went cold. But Ray Colton never forgot. He kept Melissa's photo pinned above his desk, her smiling face a constant reminder of the night Benton County lost its innocence. And deep down, he knew, someone in this town knew exactly what happened to Melissa Harper. 36 years later, advances in DNA would blow the case wide open. But in 1988, Sheriff Colton couldn't have known that the cigarette butt, ignored and stored away, would one day reveal a name no one expected. The first 6 months after Melissa Harper's disappearance were a whirlwind of false leads, frantic searches, and unrelenting hope. But by the time 1989 arrived, the investigation into the 19-year-old's death had slowed to a crawl. Despite weeks of canvassing, dozens of interviews, and hours of painstakingly combing through the woods where her body had been discovered, Kentucky State Police had little to show. Detectives who had once vowed to bring Melissa home, now avoided making promises they couldn't keep. The Harper family, once tight-knit, full of warmth and weekend cookouts, found themselves splintered by grief and unanswered questions. The case goes cold. The initial investigation had hinged on two major theories. A stranger attack. Investigators believed Melissa may have been abducted while driving home from her late shift at Millie's Diner, where she worked as a waitress. But no one saw anything, and there were no fingerprints, no tire marks, no definitive signs of a struggle where her car had been found. Someone she knew, friends told detectives Melissa had mentioned a man who wouldn't leave her alone. But she never named him, and without a solid lead, it was impossible to pursue. By mid-1989, detectives were frustrated. Detective Frank Dawson, the case's lead investigator, described it years later. "We hit wall after wall. Every tip we chased turned out to be smoke. It was like trying to grab fog with your hands." Each time a promising lead fizzled out, the Harper family was forced to relive the nightmare. False leads and red herrings. In the summer of 1989, a man from Bowling Green came forward claiming he'd seen a suspicious truck parked near the wooded area where Melissa's body had been found. Detectives tracked down the vehicle and interviewed the owner, a local farmhand named Rick Mallory, who admitted he'd been hunting that night. He had no criminal record, and his alibi checked out. Another time, a tip came in from a waitress at a truck stop in Hopkinsville who swore she'd overheard two men talking about a girl in Franklin who got what she deserved. Investigators spent days tracking the men down, only to learn they were talking about a different case entirely, an unrelated bar fight. "We'd get a call at 2 a.m. and be halfway across the county before realizing it was nothing," Detective Dawson recalled. "Every dead end chipped away at us, and at the Harpers." The toll on the Harper family. Inside the Harper home, time seemed to stop on the day Melissa was killed. Donna Harper, Melissa's mother, would sit for hours at the kitchen table, staring at her daughter's senior portrait, the one where she wore a light blue dress and her hair fell in soft curls. "She's frozen like that in my mind," Donna would later tell a reporter. 19 forever. Melissa's father, Jim Harper, handled his grief differently. A quiet man who worked as a mechanic, he threw himself into his job, sometimes pulling double shifts just to avoid going home to the silence. But his absence began to fracture the family. Their youngest son, Ethan, only 15 at the time, struggled the most. At school, he became withdrawn. Teachers noticed his grades slipping and his once bright personality fading. In therapy years later, Ethan admitted he felt like he'd lost both a sister and his parents that summer. "Mom lived in the past," Ethan said, "and Dad buried himself in work. I felt like a ghost in my own house." The community moves on, but the Harpers can't. Franklin, Kentucky, was a small town where bad news traveled fast. In the weeks after Melissa's death, neighbors brought casseroles, churches held vigils, and Justice for Melissa flyers were taped to storefront windows. But as months turned into years, life returned to normal, for everyone else. By the early 90s, new tragedies had replaced old ones. People stopped talking about Melissa unless the anniversary of her death came around. For Donna Harper, the silence was unbearable. She started keeping a scrapbook filled with every newspaper clipping, every flyer, and every photograph tied to the case. Each page carried a plea for answers she feared would never come. "People told me to move on," Donna recalled in a 2005 interview. How do you move on when your child's killer is still out there? Detectives rotate off the case. By 1992, Detective Dawson was reassigned to a different department, and the Harper file changed hands more than once. Each new investigator brought fresh energy but ran into the same brick walls. Key evidence was limited, and technology in the late 80s offered little help. DNA testing was still in its infancy. Samples from Melissa's clothing were collected but yielded no usable results at the time. There were no surveillance cameras in the diner parking lot or along the rural stretch of road where she disappeared. Without witnesses, detectives relied on hunches, and hunches led nowhere. By 1994, the case was effectively cold. The unseen toll on investigators. It wasn't just the Harper family who carried the weight of the unsolved murder. Detective Dawson admitted he couldn't let go of the case, even after leaving it behind. "I drive past that stretch of Highway 31 and still see her. That girl's face haunted me. Every time a lead came in, even years later, I'd pick up the phone hoping it was the one." For him, Melissa wasn't just another file in a cabinet. She was a teenager whose life had been stolen, and failing to find her killer gnawed at him long after he retired. Anniversaries and unanswered prayers. Every July, on the anniversary of Melissa's death, the Harpers would drive to the clearing where her body was found. Donna would bring lilies, Melissa's favorite flower, and set them gently against the base of the oak tree nearby. Sometimes Ethan would come. Sometimes Jim wouldn't. I thought going there together would heal us, Donna said softly. Instead, it just reminded us how broken we were. Their grief became a quiet ritual. Each passing year deepened the ache and dulled the hope that justice would ever come. A decade of silence. By the early 2000s, Melissa's case file sat gathering dust in a backroom archive at the Kentucky State Police Post 3 headquarters. Every so often, a curious young detective would pull it out, flip through the yellowed pages, and sigh at the lack of leads. Then they'd put it back. The Harper family stopped calling for updates. It hurt too much to hear the same words again and again. We're still working on it. The break yet to come. Unbeknownst to anyone, the key to cracking Melissa Harper's case had been sitting in an evidence locker since 1988. A single item, overlooked for decades, would eventually become the thread that unraveled the mystery. But in 1998, 10 years after her death, no one could have imagined it. For the Harpers, for Detective Dawson, for the entire community of Franklin, Melissa had become another cold case, another name on a forgotten list. Only the killer knew the truth. And he was still out there. By the summer of 1990, 2 years after Melissa Harper's body was found by the old railway trestle, the small town of Ashwood, Kentucky, had transformed her tragedy into something else entirely. The facts of Melissa's murder were horrifying enough. A bright, artistic 19-year-old vanished one humid July night, only to be found days later under the shadow of the abandoned trestle, her life brutally cut short. But when no arrests came and the investigation stalled, the unknown began to fester. And in Ashwood, the unknown became legend. A town haunted by silence. 4 weeks after the murder, residents avoided the trestle road entirely. Parents warned their children never to take the shortcut past Fletcher's Creek after sunset. Hunters and fishermen stopped venturing near the wooded trails, muttering about bad energy clinging to that stretch of land. By autumn, Ashwood had grown quieter, too quiet. Whispers filled the space where answers should have been. Somebody out there knows something, I swear it. One waitress muttered over coffee refills at Ruby's Diner, her voice low but urgent. Folks don't just vanish like that, and nobody sees nothing. And yet, no one did. The investigation yielded no witnesses, no weapon, no clear motive. Out of that vacuum, the town began writing its own story. The first rumors, the man by the tracks. Not long after Melissa's funeral, people began claiming they'd seen a tall man lurking near the tracks. Always at night. Always silent. Some said he wore a dark hunting jacket and carried an old lantern. Others swore they'd seen him kneeling by the trestle, whispering into the earth like he was talking to someone buried there. One teenager claimed he followed him one night, only to watch the man vanish into the fog. For the police, these stories were useless. There was no consistency, no evidence. But for Ashwood, the man by the tracks became an obsession. Kids dared each other to sneak out to the trestle and look for him. Couples parked under the stars and whispered about him in the dark, each retelling more dramatic than the last. By Christmas of '88, the first urban myth was cemented. Melissa's killer walks the trestle at night, lantern in hand, looking for his next victim. The curse of Fletcher's Creek. Then came the curse stories. An older generation remembered tragedies tied to that same patch of land, a drowning back in 1959, a train derailment in the early 70s, even a missing child in 1975. Locals began connecting dots that might not have existed, convincing themselves that Fletcher's Creek was cursed. At Ashwood High School, students whispered that Melissa wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last. If you crossed the trestle after midnight, one freshman warned, you'll hear Melissa crying. And if you follow the sound, you never come back. The sheriff's office dismissed these tales, but the legends carried their own power. Parents started grounding their kids longer. Hunters avoided the woods completely. Businesses near the creek saw fewer customers. Ruby's Diner closed 2 hours earlier than it used to. The town itself seemed to recoil inward. Late-night radio fuel. In 1989, a local AM station began running a late-night call-in segment called Ashwood After Dark. Originally meant for ghost stories and UFO sightings, Melissa's case dominated the lines. Callers whispered about shadowy figures, unmarked vans, and strangers passing through town. One night, a trembling voice called in. I saw her. I saw Melissa. She was standing on the trestle, barefoot, hair wet like she'd been in the creek. I called her name, and she smiled at me. Then she stepped off the edge. The host laughed it off as a prank, but within weeks, teenagers were sneaking out at night, hoping to glimpse Melissa's ghost. Police had to chase them off the trestle more than once. The outsider theory. By 1990, another story began to take root, one that struck deeper fear. Maybe Melissa's killer wasn't from Ashwood at all. Truckers passing through on Route 41 became the new villains in whispered theories. Stories surfaced of unmarked semis parking near the trestle late at night, headlights off, drivers vanishing into the woods. Someone from out of town did this, declared Bill Harper, Melissa's father, at a community meeting in '89. Someone who knew would never find him. The police neither confirmed nor denied the possibility, but the absence of answers made the theory stick. Now, anyone unfamiliar, a stranger at a gas station, a passing camper, even a delivery driver, was eyed with suspicion. Ashwood turned paranoid, each unmarked car and wandering face a potential killer. The Harper family's burden. For Lydia Harper, Melissa's mother, these stories were unbearable. She stopped going to the grocery store because people would approach her in the aisles, whispering things like, "I heard she was taken by a cult." Someone said the Harper girl's ghost is haunting Fletcher's Creek. Have you gone out there to talk to her? Each myth chipped away at her, turning her daughter's murder into a sideshow. By 1991, Lydia withdrew completely. Friends said she rarely left the house except for church. Her husband, Bill, grew bitter and angry, blaming both the police and the people feeding the legends. For them, Melissa wasn't a ghost story. She was a daughter. And they feared the truth would be buried under the noise. The detective's frustration. Detective Ray Holden, who'd been on the case since day one, hated the myths more than anyone. "Every time we think we got something solid," he told a local reporter, "we get 20 calls about some damn ghost or a man with a lantern. Half my leads are teenagers daring each other out by the creek." Holden worried the real killer was watching it all unfold, laughing as the town distracted itself with shadows. By 1992, Melissa's case was two stories. There was the official story: a 19-year-old vanished, was murdered, and her killer was never caught. And then there was the Ashwood story. A haunted trestle where Melissa's ghost wandered. A lantern-carrying killer stalking the woods. A cursed creek that swallowed the unlucky whole. For outsiders, Ashwood became a place of whispers and warnings. For locals, it became a prison of fear and folklore. And underneath it all, one unshakable truth remained. Someone out there still knew what happened to Melissa Harper. And they were staying very, very quiet. Late one summer night in 1992, a group of teenagers snuck out to Fletcher's Creek, carrying flashlights and a cassette recorder. They wanted to catch Melissa's ghost on tape. Hours later, they returned, pale and silent, refusing to speak of what they'd heard. The only thing one boy would whisper, weeks later, was this: "We heard footsteps. Not on the trestle. Behind us." March 2019, Frankfort, Kentucky. The smell of dust and mildew filled the air of the Frankfort Police Department's evidence storage room. Dim, flickering fluorescent lights cast pale shadows across rows of towering metal shelves, each packed with cardboard boxes labeled in fading marker, decades of unsolved mysteries collecting dust. Detective Carla Jennings, 47, ran her gloved fingers along the edges of one particular shelf. She was supposed to be working a routine evidence audit, a job most detectives dreaded, but something about this day felt different. Then she saw it. A faded brown box with peeling white tape, its handwriting barely legible. Harper, Melissa, homicide, 1988. Carla froze. She'd heard whispers of this case when she first joined the department in the late 90s, an unsolved murder of a 19-year-old from Lawrenceburg. The box had been untouched for years. Inside, she found Melissa's clothing, photographs of the creek where her body had been discovered, old witness statements, and a small manila envelope labeled "Biological evidence, do not open." It had been sealed since 1988. Carla sighed. Back then, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. They'd collected evidence, but technology simply couldn't process it. Today, though, it could. And just like that, a cold case long forgotten had a pulse again. Flashback montage, how it went cold. We cut between images and narration, pulling viewers back into the frustration investigators felt in 1988 and the years that followed. September 17, 1988, Melissa Harper fails to return home after her shift at Harrison's Diner. September 18, 1988, her body is discovered near Clover Creek, strangled and partially submerged. 1989, dozens of suspects questioned, but but nothing sticks. 1990s 2000s. The case file bounces between detectives. Leads grow cold. Witnesses move, die, or forget. By 2005, Melissa's name barely comes up anymore. But now, 31 years later, Carla had the chance to change that. The call that changes everything. Carla brought the box to Lieutenant Robert Ellis, head of cold cases. At first, Ellis was hesitant. Reopening dormant cases cost money, and there were dozens competing for resources. Carla, sir, we've got untested biological evidence. If we send this out for DNA, we might get a hit. Ellis, Carla, you know how many times I've heard that? Half these kits come back empty. The other half, dead ends. Carla, and sometimes, they come back with answers. Beat, she was 19, Rob. 19. Ellis studied her, then nodded slowly. Ellis, all right. Do it. Within days, the sealed envelope was shipped to a state forensic lab in Louisville. Parallel storyline, Melissa's mother. While the lab began its testing, across town Linda Harper, Melissa's now 71-year-old mother, sat in her quiet kitchen, flipping through old photographs. She didn't know yet that Carla had reopened the case. To her, Melissa's murder was a wound that never healed. Over the decades, Linda had watched other families get closure while hers remained trapped in uncertainty. Linda, interview, 2019. I stopped asking questions after a while. You have to. Every time I called, they said, we're still working on it. Then the call stopped. I thought, maybe they forgot about her. She had no idea that, for the first time in 30 years, detectives were closer than ever to an answer. The lab results. By June 2019, the Louisville lab had completed its testing. Carla received the email late one evening. DNA profile developed, uploading to CODIS. She barely slept that night. Weeks passed as the profile was processed through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a massive database containing millions of samples from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scenes. Then, one humid July afternoon, Carla's desk phone rang. Forensic analyst. Detective Jennings? You might want to sit down for this. We've got a match. Carla's hand tightened around the receiver. Carla, who is it? Forensic analyst. Name's Daniel Whitaker. Arrested in 1994 for burglary, released in 96. His DNA was entered into CODIS back then. Carla stared at the box on her desk, Melissa's box. After 31 years, a name had surfaced. The weight of a breakthrough. The news sent ripples through the department. Some younger detectives had never even heard of Melissa Harper. For veterans like Ellis, the name was a ghost from their early careers. Carla and Ellis pored over Whitaker's old records. In 1988, he'd been 23 and working construction jobs around Anderson County. He had a minor rap sheet back then, but nothing violent. Carla, no one even looked at him back then? Ellis, he wasn't on our radar. Lived 2 towns over. Wrong place, wrong time, or so we thought. Now, his DNA placed him at the crime scene. Family notification, a shattering moment. Before moving forward, Carla needed to tell Melissa's mother. The camera follows her as she parks outside Linda Harper's modest home. It's overcast, wind rustling the trees, a somber tone. Carla, Mrs. Harper, we've reopened Melissa's case. Linda, stunned pause, reopened? After all this time? Carla, yes. We've developed new DNA evidence. And we've identified a suspect. Linda's trembling hands covered her mouth. Her voice cracked. Linda, I thought you'd all forgotten her. Carla reached across the table, her tone soft but firm. Carla, we didn't forget. And we're not stopping now. Community shockwaves. News spread quickly through Lawrenceburg. For decades, Melissa Harper's murder had been the town's deepest unsolved scar. Now, suddenly, there was a suspect. Old fears resurfaced. Long-buried memories stirred. People who'd lived through 1988 found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. Local news stations ran headlines like, DNA match leads to break in 31-year-old murder case. Reporters showed up at Harrison's Diner, interviewing patrons who still remembered Melissa's last shift. Former co-worker, on camera. She left around 10 p.m. I never thought, after all these years, they'd finally find him. The spark that ignited the hunt. The catalyst event, a dusty box, a sealed envelope, a single swab of DNA, had cracked the case wide open. But Carla knew this wasn't the end. Finding Whitaker was next. Building a case that would hold up in court was another battle entirely. For the first time in 3 decades, the Harper family had hope. And for the first time, Daniel Whitaker had reason to be afraid. It was early spring of 2019 when the case file of Melissa Harper, 19 years old, murdered in 1988, landed once again on a detective's desk. For over 30 years, it had sat dormant, gathering dust on the back shelves of the Kentucky State Police archives. The faded folder, its edges curled and yellowed, carried the weight of a generation's worth of unanswered questions. Inside were grainy crime scene photos, typewritten reports, and statements scribbled by investigators who had long since retired. The lead investigator in 2019 was Detective Karen Whitfield, a woman in her 40s who had grown up in rural Kentucky herself. She had been a teenager the year Melissa died, only a few years younger, and she remembered the whispers around town, the fear, the unanswered questions, the way Melissa's smile on old yearbook photos seemed to follow her long after the story faded from the newspapers. When she first pulled the case file from the shelf, Karen sat for nearly an hour just leafing through it. She studied the photographs of Melissa's abandoned car by the roadside, the dark woods where her body was later found, and the haunting black and white morgue shots. She read the early witness statements, the notes about potential suspects, the scribbled frustrations of detectives who admitted they were running into dead ends even within months of the murder. But it wasn't just nostalgia that brought the case back to life. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, were sweeping through cold case units across the country. Across America, families who had been waiting for decades were finally getting answers. Kentucky wanted to be part of that wave. The first step, revisiting evidence. Karen ordered the evidence boxes from the archives, each sealed and catalogued decades ago. Inside, she found Melissa's clothing from the night of her death, carefully preserved in plastic. There were cigarette butts collected near the scene, strands of hair, and fingernail scrapings taken during the autopsy. Back in 1988, this evidence had been stored with the hope that maybe one day science would advance enough to make sense of it. Now, that day had come. The items were carefully sent to the state forensic lab, where modern DNA technology could extract genetic material from even the smallest, most degraded samples. Analysts swabbed Melissa's fingernails, tested her clothing, and re-examined the cigarette butts. Weeks later, results began to trickle in. And there it was, a DNA profile. It wasn't much, just a partial profile at first, but enough to build a genetic fingerprint of someone who had been at the scene. The breakthrough, CODIS. The sample was run through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a database that held millions of profiles collected from convicted offenders and arrestees. It was a long shot. Many cold cases had profiles that yielded no hits, either because the perpetrator had never been caught for another crime or because the technology hadn't fully mapped their DNA. But in this case, there was a hit. The name attached to the profile, James Jimmy Randall, a man in his early 20s back in 1988, who had lived just 2 towns over from where Melissa was found. Randall wasn't on police radar back then. His name barely appeared in the old files, mentioned once in passing in a neighbor's statement, nothing more. In the years since, he had been arrested multiple times for burglary and assault. A stint in prison for domestic violence had landed his DNA in the system. That's where the match came from. For Karen Whitfield, this was the moment where past and present collided. She knew that a DNA match wasn't a conviction, it was a lead, not a guarantee. But it was the strongest lead the Harper family had been given in 3 decades. Digging into the suspect. The next phase was building a case. Karen and her team began tracing Jimmy Randall's movements in 1988. They learned he had dropped out of high school at 17, working odd jobs in construction and auto repair. He had a reputation for being hot-tempered, especially when drinking. Old acquaintances described him as the kind of guy who'd snap if you looked at him wrong. One neighbor remembered something chilling. The night Melissa disappeared, Randall's pickup truck had been parked along the same stretch of highway where Melissa's car was later discovered. At the time, no one had thought much of it, just another local kid cruising. But now, that memory took on a darker meaning. Karen tracked down Randall's ex-girlfriend from the late 80s, who reluctantly admitted that Jimmy had come home drunk and covered in scratches one night in the summer of 1988. She said she asked what happened, and he dismissed it as getting into a fight at a bar. Then came another detail. Melissa had scratch marks on her arms, consistent with her fighting back. Piece by piece, a mosaic was forming, rebuilding the case in the public eye. As the investigation picked up, whispers spread through the community. The local newspaper got wind of the DNA match and published an article with the headline, "Cold Case Break, New DNA Evidence Revives Melissa Harper Murder Investigation." For Melissa's family, this was both relief and terror. Relief that someone might finally face justice, but terror at the thought of reliving the trauma of seeing Melissa's last moments dissected again in court. Her younger brother, now in his 50s, told reporters, "We always hoped this day would come. But nothing can bring her back. We just want the truth, finally, after all these years." The community, too, felt the ripple. Older residents remembered the unease of that summer, the fear that lingered after Melissa's death. Younger residents, many of whom hadn't even been born in 1988, were drawn into the story as it returned to headlines. Bars, diners, and church pews buzzed with speculation. Some people still clung to the old theories, the urban myths about strangers passing through, or the possibility of a serial killer, but the DNA told a different story. This was someone local. The walls close in. Detectives built their case carefully. They surveilled Randall, now in his 50s, living in a rundown house outside Lexington. He worked odd mechanic jobs, his life marked by failed relationships and brushes with the law. When Karen and her team finally brought him in for questioning, Randall was visibly shaken when he learned his DNA had been found on Melissa's clothing. He denied knowing her, claimed he had never met the girl. But the science said otherwise. Every denial only tightened the noose. By late 2020, the Kentucky State Police were ready to present the case to the grand jury. For the first time in 32 years, the Harper family had something they had thought impossible, a chance at justice. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the Kentucky State Crime Lab in Frankfort as Detective Laura Whitaker leaned over the workstation, her palms flat on the cold, stainless steel surface. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple despite the room's chill. On the computer monitor before her, the results from the 2023 DNA comparison flickered into focus. Her heart thudded in her chest as the screen displayed a match. Finally, after 35 years of dead ends, missing evidence, and unanswered questions, Melissa Harper's case had just cracked wide open. The DNA match. The breakthrough had come from a recent push by the Kentucky Attorney General's office to run decades-old DNA samples through the National CODIS database. A single, degraded sample, retrieved from the hem of Melissa's torn blouse back in 1988, had been carefully retested using advanced technology that didn't exist back then. The result was a direct hit. The name on the screen. Douglas "Doug" Reeves, 59 years old, a former local mechanic who'd left Kentucky in the early 90s and resurfaced in southern Indiana. Whitaker sat back, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Doug Reeves. The name had barely come up in the original investigation. He'd been questioned as part of a wide sweep of local men, but he'd offered a rock-solid alibi back then. No one had ever dug deeper. Until now. Building the case. Detective Whitaker called in Special Agent Mark Rivers from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, who had been consulting on the reopened case since early 2023. Together, they sat in the small conference room lined with whiteboards covered in photographs, timelines, and names connected to Melissa's life. "This is it," Rivers said, tapping Reeves' DMV photo from 1990. "This is the first real lead we've had that isn't built on rumor." But DNA alone wasn't enough to make an arrest. They needed corroboration, motive, opportunity, and evidence that could hold up in court. They dug back into Reeves' past, piecing together fragments of a life that had been deliberately kept quiet. Reeves had worked at Mason's Auto Repair, less than 2 miles from where Melissa's car had been found abandoned in July 1988. Even more chilling, Whitaker uncovered an old police report from April 1987. A 17-year-old waitress from a nearby town had accused Reeves of cornering her outside a diner after her late shift. No charges had been filed. "Pattern of behavior," Whitaker muttered, pinning the report beneath his photo. Revisiting witnesses. With Reeves' name in hand, Whitaker and Rivers revisited the old witnesses from 1988. Most were older now, scattered across Kentucky and beyond, but memories that had dulled with time sometimes flared sharp when triggered. They tracked down Donna Keller, Melissa's high school friend who had been at the bonfire the night Melissa disappeared. Donna was hesitant at first, but when Reeves' name came up, her expression changed. "Doug Reeves," she whispered, as if saying the name too loudly might summon him. "Yeah. I remember him. He used to hang around the high school parking lot. Gave everyone the creeps. He tried talking to Melissa once, but she told him to back off." Donna hadn't mentioned Reeves in 1988 because, at the time, she didn't think he was relevant. "We all thought it was somebody from out of town. I mean, who'd suspect Doug? He was just there." Piece by piece, Reeves' presence in Melissa's orbit began to materialize. Surveillance and strategy. By September 2023, Reeves was under 24-hour surveillance. Living alone in a rundown rental house in Clarksville, Indiana, Reeves spent his days tinkering with an old Chevy pickup, drinking cheap beer, and frequenting a roadside bar called the Rusty Nail. Agents documented everything: his routines, his interactions, his movements. Reeves seemed oblivious to the renewed scrutiny, a man convinced that the past had been buried with time. But Whitaker knew better. Men like Reeves don't just wake up one day and decide to stop, she told Rivers as they watched surveillance footage. He's done this before. Maybe more than once. Cracking the alibi. One of the biggest challenges was dismantling Reeves' original 1988 alibi. Back then, he claimed he had been working late at Mason's Auto on the night of Melissa's disappearance. His boss at the time, Earl Mason, had backed him up completely. But Earl Mason was now in a nursing home, battling dementia. When Whitaker interviewed him, he drifted in and out of lucidity. Finally, after being shown a photo of Reeves, Earl mumbled something that made Whitaker's stomach drop. Doug, he wasn't there the whole night. Said he had to run an errand. An errand that coincided almost perfectly with the estimated time of Melissa's abduction. The knock at the door. October 2023. With the case file rebuilt and DNA results in hand, Whitaker and a team of U.S. Marshals arrived at Reeves' modest home in Clarksville just after dawn. The air was damp with early morning fog. Birds stirred in the trees as they approached the peeling front door. Whitaker's pulse pounded in her ears. 35 years, she thought. Melissa, we're finally here. A sharp knock. Mr. Reeves, this is Detective Whitaker with the Kentucky State Police. We need to speak with you. Inside, there was a pause. Then the muffled sound of boots on hardwood. The door creaked open. Reeves stood there, older now, his once dark hair gone gray, his face lined but still carrying the same unsettling emptiness Donna Keller had remembered. What's this about? He asked flatly. Melissa Harper, Whitaker replied. For the first time, Reeves' expression faltered. Just slightly. Enough for her to see it, the recognition, the buried guilt he thought no one would ever dig up. A web tightening. Reeves wasn't arrested immediately. The goal was to rattle him, to make him sweat while Whitaker quietly gathered the final threads tying him to Melissa's murder. They subpoenaed his financial records, uncovering fuel receipts from July 1988 that placed him miles away from Mason's Auto at the critical window of time. They recovered an old Polaroid photo from his garage showing Reeves at a bonfire with Melissa's group of friends weeks before she vanished, a connection he had denied having. The walls were closing in. Whitaker's midnight reflection. That night, sitting in her car overlooking the quiet Kentucky River, Whitaker flipped through the crime scene photos one last time. Melissa's smile stared back at her from an old-school portrait taped to the folder's inside cover. I promise you, she whispered into the darkness, he's not walking away again. The following week, Reeves was called in for a voluntary interview at the Kentucky State Police post. For over 2 hours, he denied knowing Melissa, denied seeing her, denied everything. Then Whitaker slid a single sheet of paper across the table, the DNA report. Reeves' hand twitched. His jaw tightened. And for the first time since 1988, Doug Reeves had no words. Outside the interrogation room, a silent clock ticked closer to justice. Melissa Harper's voice, silenced for 35 years, was finally being heard. The small town of Millersville had waited 37 years for this moment. It was a humid June morning in 2025 when Detective Raymond Fletcher sat in his unmarked sedan, watching the weathered white farmhouse at the edge of Pine Hollow Road. The early sun cast long shadows over the cracked driveway where a rusted pickup sat like a relic of another era. Inside that house was the man they believed had kept an entire town haunted since October 8, 1988, the day Melissa Harper vanished. Fletcher's hand rested on the file in his lap. Inside were hundreds of pages, old crime scene photos, witness statements, handwritten police notes, and, most importantly, the new DNA match. After decades of whispers, false leads, and dead ends, the Kentucky State Police Cold Case Unit had finally found their link. Luther Lou Carter, now 61 years old. The surveillance. Fletcher glanced at his partner, Detective Dana Cole, who sat in the passenger seat nursing her third cup of black coffee. You ready for this? Fletcher asked quietly. Cole nodded but kept her eyes on the farmhouse. He's been living like a ghost out here. No priors, no arrests, but Melissa's blood was on the floorboard of his old Chevy. That's all I need to know. Their unmarked radios crackled. Sheriff Todd Blevins's voice came through, steady but tense. Unit 3, we're green. SWAT's in position. Wait for my signal. Fletcher breathed deeply. This was it, The moment 37 years of unanswered prayers collided with hard evidence. The arrest. At precisely 9:07 a.m., a convoy of black SUVs rolled up Pine Hollow Road. Sheriff's office. Open the door. The silence inside the farmhouse stretched like a taut wire. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. When the door finally creaked open, Luther Carter stood framed in the doorway. He was older now, his once thick dark hair thinned to gray, his face lined by time. But his steel blue eyes, sharp and unnervingly calm, locked on Fletcher's as if he'd been expecting them. "You got a warrant?" he asked flatly. Fletcher held it up. "Luther Carter, you're under arrest for the murder of Melissa Harper." Carter's expression didn't change. He glanced briefly toward the dirt road beyond the trees, as if measuring the odds of running, but then extended his wrists without resistance. The cuffs clicked shut. "You boys took your sweet time," he muttered. Back at the station. The interrogation room was small and cold, its buzzing fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across Carter's weathered face. A styrofoam cup of black coffee sat untouched in front of him. Detective Cole leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Luther, the DNA doesn't lie. Melissa Harper's blood was on your truck carpet. Her hair was tangled in the fibers of that rope we pulled from your barn. This is your chance to explain." For a long while, Carter said nothing. He traced the rim of the coffee cup with a rough fingertip, his gaze distant. Finally, he sighed. "Melissa wasn't supposed to die," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the lights. Fletcher felt his stomach tighten. "Walk us through it," he said. The confession. According to Carter, the events of that night in October 1988 spiraled out of control. "I was 24, he began, his tone detached, as though recounting someone else's life. "I'd just gotten laid off from the mill. Drinking too much. Angry at the world. Melissa, she was this bright thing. Always smiling. We'd talked a few times at Murphy's Gas and Go." He rubbed his palms together, knuckles whitening. "That night, I saw her walking home from the diner after her shift. I pulled over, offered her a ride. She said no. I didn't take it well." He swallowed hard. "I grabbed her. She screamed, tried to fight. I panicked. I just wanted her to stop yelling. Next thing I know, she's on the floorboard, bleeding. I didn't mean to." Cole cut him off, her voice sharp. "You left her in the woods, Luther. For her family to spend 37 years wondering what happened." Carter stared at his hands. "I was scared," he whispered. "I thought if I hid her deep enough, no one would ever find her. And I was right. Wasn't I?" Confronting the past. The Harper family was called to the station later that afternoon. Melissa's younger brother, David Harper, now in his 50s, sat across from Fletcher, his hands trembling. "All these years," David said, his voice cracking. "And he was just living here? Like nothing happened?" Fletcher nodded solemnly. "We finally have him, David. You'll get your day in court." David stared down at a faded photograph of his sister, her radiant smile frozen in time. "My mama died never knowing," he said, tears streaking his face. "But I'll be there. I'll watch him answer for this." Community reaction. By nightfall, the news had spread across Millersville. Locals gathered at Elliot's Diner, whispering over plates of fried chicken and sweet tea. "I can't believe it was him," said Marla Benson, who'd gone to high school with Carter. "He was quiet, kept to himself. Never thought he had that darkness in him." But others weren't shocked. "You spend enough time around these parts," muttered Tommy Rayner, "you learn folks got secrets. Ain't nobody ever really who you think they are." The weight of justice. That night, Fletcher stood outside the Harper home, the air heavy with cicadas and the faint smell of honeysuckle. For decades, he'd carried Melissa's file like a scar. Now, watching David Harper light a single candle on the porch beneath his sister's framed photo, he understood something deeper. Justice didn't erase pain. It didn't rewind time. But it ended the silence. As Carter sat in a holding cell under 24-hour watch, his confession signed and recorded, Fletcher closed the case file on Melissa Harper for the first time in nearly 4 decades. Outside, the Kentucky summer thunderstorm rolled in, washing Pine Hollow clean. For Millersville, the ghosts of 1988 had finally been dragged into the light. The Fayette County Courthouse was packed on a humid morning in June 2025. The trial of Thomas "Tommy" Keene, the man accused of murdering Melissa Harper 37 years earlier, had gripped Kentucky and beyond. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras perched on shoulders, lenses clicking like metronomes. For Melissa's family, the weight of decades hung heavy. Evelyn Harper, Melissa's mother, sat in the front row clutching a worn handkerchief. It was the same one she carried the day she last hugged her daughter goodbye in August 1988. To her right sat Robert Harper, Melissa's father, stoic but pale, his weathered hands locked tightly together. The prosecution was led by Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney Linda Carmichael, a sharp and relentless presence. She stood tall as she faced the jury, her voice measured yet cutting. For nearly 4 decades, Melissa Harper's killer walked free, thinking his secret would stay buried. But science doesn't forget. Evidence doesn't lie. And justice, though delayed, cannot be denied. She gestured to a blown-up photograph of Melissa, her vibrant smile frozen in time. The defense countered fiercely. James Whitmore, Tommy Keen's attorney, painted his client as a scapegoat for a broken system, claiming that contaminated evidence and faulty memories made the case unreliable. Ladies and gentlemen, he argued, pacing deliberately, we're talking about a tragedy from 1988. Witnesses have grown old, memories fade, and technology, even DNA, has limits. Can you be sure beyond a reasonable doubt that my client is guilty? Testimonies that shook the room. The emotional peak came when Carla Jennings, Melissa's college roommate and close friend, took the stand. Now in her mid-50s, she carried the pain of that summer in her voice. Melissa wasn't just my roommate, she was my best friend, Carla said softly, her voice breaking. She told me she was worried about Tommy. He'd been following her, showing up at her work, calling her constantly. She was scared. The jury leaned in, their expressions shifting. Then came the bombshell, the forensic expert explaining the new DNA evidence. Decades-old fibers found under Melissa's fingernails had finally matched Tommy Keen's genetic profile. The courtroom fell silent. The probability of this DNA belonging to anyone other than Mr. Keen, the expert testified, is less than 1 in 1.3 billion. Tommy sat motionless at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white. The verdict. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Everyone rose as the foreperson stood, her voice steady but charged with gravity. We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Allen Keen, guilty of the murder of Melissa Harper. A muffled gasp rippled through the courtroom. Evelyn Harper covered her mouth with both hands as tears streamed down her face. Robert bowed his head, shoulders shaking silently. Tommy Keen stared straight ahead, his face pale and unreadable. For a moment, he seemed less like the predator painted by the prosecution and more like a man crushed under the weight of inevitability. Judge L. Whitcomb pronounced the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mr. Keen, the judge said sternly, you stole a young woman's life and left her family without answers for 37 years. Today, justice finally finds you. Aftermath, healing and scars. Outside the courthouse, the summer air was thick with tension and relief. News crews swarmed the steps, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. Evelyn Harper faced the cameras briefly, her voice trembling yet resolute. Melissa was everything to us. We've waited so long to hear the word guilty. But no verdict can bring my daughter back. We hope this brings awareness to other families still waiting for justice. For Detective Hank Morrison, who had reopened the case 2 years earlier, the moment was bittersweet. Standing off to the side, hands in his pockets, he watched as the Harpers embraced. It's not the kind of win you celebrate, he later told a local reporter. You don't feel triumphant. You just feel tired. But I'll tell you this, Melissa finally gets to rest. Community reflection. Lexington had changed since 1988, but the case left a lasting imprint on its identity. For decades, the mystery of Melissa Harper's disappearance had become entwined with urban legends, whispers about hitchhiking dangers, haunted woods, and unsolved murders. Now, with the truth exposed, those myths began to fade, replaced by hard facts and a sobering reality. Evil had always been closer than they'd imagined. Bars and diners buzzed with conversations. People who'd gone to high school with Melissa reconnected on social media, sharing grainy yearbook photos and stories of the bright, sweet girl taken too soon. But closure didn't come easily for everyone. Some locals felt betrayed that Tommy Keen, a man who'd lived among them all these years, raising a family and attending church, could hide something so dark. Others were frustrated that the investigation had stalled for so long. We could have known 30 years ago, one resident lamented on a radio call-in show. Makes you wonder how many other cases are out there, waiting. Evelyn's last words. 2 weeks after the sentencing, Evelyn Harper visited Melissa's grave for the first time in years without feeling the weight of unanswered questions pressing on her chest. She knelt, laying fresh lilies across the stone, and whispered, "Baby, They finally know. They finally said it out loud. He can't hurt anyone anymore. Her tears fell onto the soil, but for the first time in decades, they weren't from hopelessness, they were from release. The Harper family, though forever marked by tragedy, began to rediscover moments of peace. The courtroom had emptied, the cameras packed away, but the echoes of Melissa Harper's case lingered in the halls of the Fayette County Courthouse. Detective Carla Jennings, now in her late 50s, walked the corridors alone, holding a cup of lukewarm coffee. She ran her fingers along the polished oak railing, thinking about the long, unbroken line of cases that had come before Melissa's, the young lives stolen, families left suspended in grief, and investigations abandoned for decades. Melissa's case was closed, finally. But the implications reached far beyond a single murder. The toll of time. For 37 years, Melissa Harper's story had been frozen in amber. Investigators had faced limited technology, fading memories, and scarce resources. Communities had whispered urban legends, children had dared each other to visit the creek, and families had carried the weight of unanswered questions. Carla thought about Evelyn Harper, Melissa's mother, who had waited decades for justice. Some families never get an answer, Carla reflected quietly. Some families live and die without closure. Melissa's mother, though, she got to see the verdict. She got to know who took her daughter. That's rare. The detective understood that justice, when delayed, could only offer a bittersweet reprieve. Technological revolution. The DNA breakthrough that solved Melissa's murder highlighted the transformative power of modern forensic science. Samples once considered unusable had now become crucial pieces of evidence. Carla met with state forensic analyst Miguel Ortiz in the lab, reviewing the case's evolution. Ortiz, 30 years ago, we could barely extract a profile from Melissa's blouse. Today, with advanced PCR amplification and CODIS, even degraded samples tell a story. He gestured to a screen displaying hundreds of cold cases waiting for analysis. Melissa's case isn't just about her, it's about all the unsolved murders and assaults out there. Technology can't bring back victims, but it can finally speak for them. Carla nodded. It wasn't just the equipment, it was persistence, dedication, and the refusal to let time erase a life from memory. Impact on the community. Lawrenceburg and the surrounding counties had been profoundly affected by Melissa's disappearance. 37 years of uncertainty had shaped community consciousness, how people parented, how they trusted strangers, and even how they navigated the back roads of small-town Kentucky. Local newspaper editor Helen Graves noted in a reflection piece, "Cases like Melissa Harper's leave scars. They remind us how fragile life is, how fleeting innocence can be. But they also remind us that truth eventually surfaces, and communities can heal, even if it takes decades." At Melissa's high school reunion, former classmates shared memories and reconciled decades of speculation. They remembered her laughter, her drive, and the energy she brought into every room. For many, the verdict was as much about reclaiming her story as it was about punishing the man responsible. Changes in law enforcement practices. Melissa Harper's case had ripple effects in Kentucky's approach to cold cases. Departments across the state began reassessing archived evidence, ensuring that samples were stored for future testing. Policies were implemented for cataloging biological evidence systematically, re-examining cold cases with new forensic tools, prioritizing collaboration between counties. Detective Jennings participated in workshops and panels, advising younger investigators. Don't assume a case is too old to solve. Don't let paperwork or missing leads deter you. Every victim deserves a voice, even decades later. Her words resonated with a new generation of detectives who were entering a field that had become increasingly technical yet remained profoundly human. Societal reflections. The Melissa Harper case highlighted broader societal challenges. Limited funding for rural policing often left smaller jurisdictions with insufficient resources for long-term investigations. Unreported threats or minor criminal activity could grow into catastrophic violence if unchecked. The human cost of delay, families forced to live with ambiguity and grief, was immeasurable. Community organizers and advocacy groups used Melissa's story to lobby for statewide cold case units and better support for victims' families. Melissa Harper was a catalyst, said Linda Carmichael, the attorney who prosecuted the case. Her story reminded everyone that justice delayed is not justice denied, but it can be devastatingly slow. Personal reflection. Detective Carla Jennings. One evening, Carla visited Clover Creek, the site where Melissa's body had been found in 1988. The sun dipped low, casting a warm golden glow across the water. Dragonflies flitted over the surface, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves and distant birds. She knelt, imagining Melissa as she might have been that night, laughing with friends, dreaming of a future cut short. "We finally found him," Carla whispered. "And yet, it still hurts." The creek carried her words downstream, as if the current could somehow transport them to Melissa herself. In that moment, Carla understood the dual nature of her work: triumph and sorrow, resolution and lingering grief, a broader message. Melissa Harper's story had become more than a single tragic murder. It was a testament to perseverance, technology, and human resilience. It reminded law enforcement, families, and communities that persistence can overcome decades of silence. Science, when paired with human determination, can finally speak for victims. Closure is rarely complete, but even partial resolution matters. As Carla left the creek that evening, she glanced back at the water and whispered once more, "Rest now, Melissa. We finally told your story right." The wind rustled through the trees, a quiet affirmation, and for the first time in 37 years, the air around Clover Creek felt lighter. Melissa Harper's case had ended in justice, but it had changed the way small towns, law enforcement, and families approach cold cases. It became a blueprint, a symbol of hope for the long-forgotten and a warning that the passage of time cannot hide the truth forever. The story of a 19-year-old from Kentucky now resonated far beyond Lawrenceburg, an enduring lesson in memory, loss, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The courtroom had emptied weeks ago. Melissa Harper's killer was behind bars, and for the first time in 37 years, the Harper family could breathe. Detective Carla Jennings sat in her office at the Fayette County Cold Case Unit, sifting through new case files. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, a mix of comfort and urgency. Her computer pinged with an email marked Urgent, Review. Curious, she opened it. Attached were photographs of a small town in eastern Kentucky, a quiet community bordered by forested hills and winding creeks. The first image showed a young woman, about 18, standing outside a diner, smiling at the camera. A second image showed a creek where a body had been discovered weeks ago, partially hidden beneath fallen leaves. The file had a single note typed in stark black font. Victim found near Clover Creek. Similarities to Harper case. Suspect unknown. Immediate review requested. Carla's heart tightened. She stared at the screen. The memory of Melissa's case came rushing back. The creek, the riverside trails, the forested edges where a life could be stolen and left undiscovered. "Not again," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She picked up the phone and dialed Lieutenant Robert Ellis, who had overseen the Harper investigation. "Ellis, Jennings. Carla, we've got a new one. Eastern Kentucky. Female victim. Creekside. Undetermined cause, but there are echoes of Melissa Harper here." Ellis pauses, voice tense, "Show me everything." As the call ended, Carla leaned back in her chair. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the office walls. She rubbed her temples and glanced at a photograph pinned to the corkboard, a smiling Melissa Harper, frozen in time. Somewhere out there, another family was waiting for answers. And somewhere, the killer, different, unknown, yet just as calculated, was still free. Carla pulled a fresh file from the drawer, flipping it open to reveal handwritten notes from the local sheriff, witness statements, and aerial photos of the creek. A pattern emerged almost immediately. The same secluded areas, the same timing of disappearances, the same community whispers ignored for years. Her phone buzzed again. Another email. This one contained a tip from a caller claiming to know the suspect, a man who had been seen near the creek in the days leading up to the victim's disappearance. The handwriting was shaky, urgent, almost desperate. Carla's pulse quickened. "Looks like we're not done yet," she murmured, gripping the edge of her desk. She grabbed her coat and keys, heading out the door. As she stepped into the warm Kentucky evening, she glanced up at the sky. The sun was dipping behind the tree line, shadows stretching across the streets like fingers. Somewhere, in the quiet hills and hidden creeks, a new story was waiting to unfold. And she would be the one to chase it. The camera pans to Clover Creek, still and dark, leaves drifting across its surface. A faint ripple disturbs the water as if someone, or something, just moved through it. The echo of Melissa Harper's case lingers in the air, a reminder that justice is never final, and the next case is always waiting.